if I remember
Yeah.
right, you had a bunch of apples in your like lead shot or whatever for the feature. That was the one in Euro, right?
That was Import Racer. It was
Okay,
Import Racer
that's
that
the one
had
I
the apples, I
remember.
think. Yeah. 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 And the one with Lowrider Euro had a model with it, which was funny because when the model showed up, it turned out my friend who was with me had dated her at one point. So it was,
Oops.
yeah, it was kind of a funny moment. But yeah, at that point, the car was known as the Bad Apple. It was apple green, and I always kind of thought it was a funny little name, a funny little nickname for it.
Welcome back, guys, to another episode of Modified Rides Podcast. Today, I have one of those OG names that any of you that's been in this scene for any amount of time will recognize. What's going on? I got Kevin Whips today. What's up?
Howdy, sir. How are you doing?
Good, good. Uh, you're definitely someone that, like I say, keeps coming up when I say, who should I have come on? You know, you've been involved in this scene off and on for what, 30 years now?
Yeah, I think so, huh? Because I think the first run I went to was Endless Summer '94, so that was the first big car event I did. So yeah, I guess it's 30 years this September, I guess. Wow, crap.
I guess you'd say Kevin's big thing that kind of, I guess, put him on the map. If any of you guys, especially the import guys, remember Bad Apple, Bad Apple kind of set the bar. His Civic kind of set the bar for what a lot of the wasn't body drop back then, but I guess you had it as low as you could at the time. So we'll dive into that for sure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's something that comes up once every couple of months. Somebody will bring up the Civic, and I'll go, "Oh yeah, 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 that was me." Yeah,
Same
I had
thing with
more hair
my
back then.
CRX. So, you know, I was one of the ones I
Yeah.
followed being a Honda guy myself. So, you know, you try to see
Hmm.
what all the other trends were back then. So, same as now, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure.
So, I guess let's go ahead and start back towards the beginning. What got you into modified vehicles? Were you a kid? Did you come up with it later in life? Like, how did you get involved in that?
Well, when I was a kid, I was into cars, like everybody was. I was into the three big toy groups that were my thing were Lego and Transformers and GI Joe, and I loved all the vehicles. I was into all that kind of stuff. And then I grew up in Massachusetts, and we moved from Massachusetts to Arizona, which is where I live now. And when we did that, we loaded everything into this 27-foot long Ryder box truck. And my dad drove, and I sat in the passenger seat with this little disposable camera that I had, and I took pictures of every Camaro or Porsche or Corvette or anything that drove by that I thought was cool. When we got here, my dad had a 72 Jaguar E-Type at the time. It's a coupe, it's a 12 cylinder, it's got a hood that's a mile long, just a
Yeah.
crazy looking car. So cool and so fun. And he had that out here. And so my dad was kind of into it, not anywhere near to the level that I was. And then the other big factor, I think, as I've kind of considered this question myself, is, when you hit high school, you have friends who are into cars and you have friends who are doing stuff. And my parents lived in Scottsdale, Arizona, and there were a lot of off-road trucks, a lot of Jeeps, a lot of lifted vehicles, a lot of things like that that were popular at the time. But one other thing that was a really big deal was the sport truck and truck scene. Mid 90s, early to mid 90s, sport truck and
Yeah.
truckin' are huge. I mean, they're just mammoth publications, both physically and otherwise. And sport truck in particular had some kind of connection with a shop out here called Truck Creations by Verdone. And Truck Creations by Verdone was on Scottsdale Road, and they did a lot of work with a painter named Mike Learn. And Mike Learn did these super realistic murals. I think he was one of the first people to do tearaway graphics. And like he the Truck Creations trucks and the Mike Learn painted trucks ended up on the cover of Sport Truck numerous times. And that was my neighborhood. Like I saw those trucks
Oh wow.
all the time. So it was like the exposure to these things was intense. So when I turned 16, I get my first car. I start fooling around with car stereo, which is like, the entry point for everybody,
Yep.
right? It's the easiest thing to do.
Did the
And
same thing.
then Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then eventually it leads into, well, can I lower it? And then, I get my truck. Well, I had a Toyota pickup for a while. And so you get your truck and you lower it and you notch it. And I had air shocks at the time. And, okay, that's great. And then what are you going to do? And just the kind of evolution goes along. And eventually, once I got into car clubs and I started meeting people who were doing stuff that they knew what they were doing, it all kind of went downhill from there. I went full bore into it and dove right in.
So when did you tear into the Civic? Was that an early build for you, or is that something that you had several before that one?
It's weird. I was, it was 96, so I was 20, but in a strange twist, I had three cars before then. My first car was a 88 Daihatsu Charade that was garbage. It was a three-cylinder, five-speed.
Sue's all you had
And
to say on that.
yeah, yeah, it was, here in Phoenix, most of the town is flat. And, we live in a valley. And there's a town called Fountain Hills where to get to it, you have to go up one of the mountains and then you crest over the edge and, the town's all right there. For me, in my three-cylinder, five-speed Daihatsu Charade, if I had to go up to Fountain Hills, I'd have to downshift into second and sometimes into first just to crest that hill a little bit. It had so little power. Anyways, I had tons of problems with that thing, and so it wasn't even my senior year before I had to get something different. And I got a Toyota pickup, and I had it lowered at Truck Creations by Verdone, and I did a bunch of stuff with it. And then I was going to school. I was going to college down in Tucson, and there was this pink Toyota pickup that was there. And it was lowered more than mine. It had a roll pan. It was painted like a metallic pink with like a pearl to it. It was a pretty neat truck, and it had some kind of mural on the back window that I couldn't quite figure out. And it was a really neat ride. And so I left a note on the window. I wrote something down. I put it on the windshield wiper, like, hey, I'm interested in getting to know about these trucks more. Who did your work? Can I help you out? And it was a girl named Adrian who owned it, and she lived in Phoenix like I did most of the time. And so I went up one weekend and I met her boyfriend, Danny, and he introduced me to his car club, which was Severed Ties. So I got into Severed Ties pretty early on. I think it was 94, maybe. And, with this barely lowered truck and, nothing super special about it or
Yeah.
anything like that. And as it went on, I would do more things to it and I would learn more stuff. That truck ended up causing me some problems and I sold it. And then I got a 92 Civic hatchback, which was totaled within a month by a drunk driver. So I had to get a new car. So I went to the dealership and I looked at Civics, and the 96 body style was brand new and nobody I knew had any. And I was considering the hatchback because my 92 was a hatch. And I asked the guy, I was like, how much more for the coupe a month? And he's like, I don't know, like $10. And I look at my dad, and my dad's like, yeah, you should get the coupe. And I was like, all right, cool, I'll get the coupe. So I bought the car. It was a 96 Civic DX, and it was the first full build. Let's say that. It was the first like over the top, I'm painting it, I'm going nuts. That was the first car. Yeah, that was the car that kind of started everything for me in a weird way.
That's about the time that I got my CRX, because I bought it in December '93,
Yeah.
middle of my senior year, and did the 13-inch ICWs on it, and we cut the
Right.
springs, and like 8-9 months later, where we had nicked one of the coils above the spring where we'd cut, it broke, so I had to take another coil out. So I think my
Yep.
disc probably rides better than that thing did back then. But there wasn't a lot of parts back then. You couldn't get springs for everything. You could, air suspension wasn't a thing. But that's about the time I started on mine. I mean, I tore it down in '97 to shave and paint and everything. So it seems like about the same time frame.
Yeah, it was I'll talk more about this later, but I was doing some research on the history of air ride recently, and the I talked to this guy out who was one of the first people at the chop shop out in California, and he was one of the first people to bag anything. And back then it was, if you wanted an airbag, it was a truck stop, it was a couple $100. You know, these were expensive parts, and I didn't know too many people who could afford it. I had a friend who was around the corner from my house who was building a Mazda extra cab long bed, and he had mandrel bent frames, and it was super cool. But it was like paddle valves and like this little tiny Firestone compressor, and all this stuff. Like actually bagging something was a really expensive proposition, and it was really, really rare. So um, so back then I didn't have any of those opportunities. My Toyota had air shocks on it. Like it wasn't something that I ever considered. So the path with the Civic, when I got it, like you said, there wasn't a whole ton of options, but because my car was a DX, so it was the lower model, I didn't have
Yep.
a lot of engine options.
That's what my
And then
CRX
because
does too.
Right. And because the car was new, I didn't have a lot of suspension options either. Eventually, New Speed came out with a pair of springs, and I took it to my friend Zoe's house, and we lowered it in his parents' driveway. And that was like the first step. After that, it was I did marker lights on the fenders. I had an SIR badge on the back. I had 16-inch wheels that I was told later they were like a super rare wheel, but I picked them up at like Tire Rack or something. They were Mantaray Sport SO6s. They were like a six-spoke machine finish, kind of racy looking
Yeah.
wheel with a little bit of a dish to it. And that was the car for a long time. And then as I started going deeper into, I had left Severed at that point. I had joined a local club called Acrophobia. And then after Acrophobia, I started my own club. And with the progression like of me in the scene and how deep I was going and how I was going on to hangouts on the weekend, and I've got a friend circle that I'm hanging out with every Saturday night. When you've got that kind of stuff going on, you end up doing a lot to your car. It's what are you doing on Saturday? I'm working
Yep.
on my car. Well, you going to school today? No, probably not. I'm probably going to work on my car. Why didn't you make it to class today? Oh, I had a leaky cylinder. I couldn't make it.
Yep.
So, um, but the progression of the car was, because this is a thing I've been asked before. Because if you've seen the finished product, you would not think that it came from where it came from. So when I bought the car, I was interested in making it look sporty, but even though I knew about Super Street Magazine and Import Tuner and all those kind of books, we're talking 96, 97. Those things existed, okay? But I did not dive into them as heavily. I was more like I was online. I was doing things like Street Source Magazine. I don't remember what year that started, but I remember being on there a lot.
It was late
You and I were talking
late
late
'90s
90s?
because I
Yeah.
know Bobby Stewart had shot my CRX in '01. So I mean,
Uh-huh.
I know it was that during that time, late '90s, like early 2000s when it was big.
Yeah. And then we were talking before, you and I had met originally back then on like some AOL Instant Messenger chat room or like an ICQ thing or something like that. I remember meeting
Any
you, and
truck
there was,
page or something.
yeah, yeah. And there was Brant Fuqua from Graphic Disorder was there, and there were a bunch of other people. So like I knew, like I was getting deep. I was trying to meet people. I was trying to do stuff. I was really like involved in the scene, but I didn't know like JDM was not a phrase that I was really familiar with. So I was not trying to build a JDM cloned car like you would today. You
Yeah.
know, I wasn't doing that. What I was aiming for actually was a European domestic market car. I had made a pen pal buddy, and it was email, and it literally turned to like snail mail because we would send each other like pictures and stuff because you couldn't email
Yep.
pictures back then. And he sent me the brochures for Honda's Civic in 97 or something. And I remember going, oh, the side markers are so cool, and they got clear corners, and the bumpers are neat. I was like, that's it. That's what I want to build. So that was my goal. But then I had all these friends who had all these really cool mini trucks, and they had sliding rag tops, and they were on air shocks or hydraulics. And I was like, oh man, those things are really cool though. So I started like, I don't know, kind of dipping my toes into that. Like I got a slider. I had a 30 by 30 Britex, and there's this picture of my car that I have where I'm on 16-inch TSW blades, which are like a split silver 5-spoke. I've got the side markers. I've got the sliding rag top. I've got a tweed interior, and I've got air shocks in the back. So it's squatted really low. And I've got new speeds up front with like 3 coils turned off. And like, I didn't have a plan. Like I was just like, oh, this is neat. I guess this is what I'll do. And I just kind of kept going. The big change though was hydraulics. When that happened, that was when everything shifted a different direction. And that's when I firmly became one of the people who was trying to build a what would eventually, I guess, kind of be called either a Euro or a mini truck inspired car.
That's the way my CRX was. It had the tweed, it had the shaved. It
Mhm.
was a mini truck with the Honda badge on it, same as yours.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I always back then it was really hard to find that stuff. Like we were in the minority. There were people out here who were doing it. I remember there was this girl in a club called Forever Low who had a 92 to 95 Civic hatchback with a shaved hatch and it was like a deep, deep purple color with like some tan in there. It was a really just a gorgeous car. And I loved that thing. And then there was this guy Rich out here who had a hatchback of the same body style. He had cut it up to make it lay. That thing was amazing. So like there were people doing it locally. And I saw people like you doing it nationally, but like we were still kind of in the minority. Like people were starting to build those JDM cars and the race cars, and I didn't feel like I had the base to be able to do that. If I had had an EX and I had had the better motor, or if I had wanted to do a motor swap, I would have. But I kind of felt like I liked the mini truck stuff. It was accessible to me, and so that was why I went down the path I went down.
I was always the all show, no go. I could care less how fast I went. It got me where I was going. You mentioned like
Hmm.
the stuff overseas with the clear markers and stuff. I remember I searched forever to try to find the clear markers for the CRX. Well, back then
Oh
the
yeah.
only ones you could get was the ones from Japan, and I can't remember the company. There's one company that would import them, and I remember they were
Hmm.
$139. I don't know why I remember that, but by the time I got the car done and painted, APC and a couple other people had the cheap
Yeah.
$39 ones, and it's like I'd point them out because it'd be like, oh no, that the cheap ones have one or two lights in it or whatever, but the Japanese ones has this. It's like no one could tell the difference looking at it, but I knew I had that Japanese part that I couldn't get anywhere else when I bought it. So parts were definitely hard to find back then.
Yeah, and that's something that has always been cool to me about cars is chasing that elusive thing that somebody else may not have, like those clear corners in your case, right? Like you want to be the person who's built a one of one. You want to be like, oh, that's like ultimately my goal back then is to be what the Civic ended up being. Like, oh, that's the Honda Civic that Kevin built, back in
Yeah.
the day, or people not remember the name of the car, or they remember the story of the car and how the car ended up. And because of all those things, it kind of turned into a little bit of a myth, almost a little bit of like a James Dean kind of Marilyn Monroe dead before its time kind of situation. Um, yeah, when I juiced the car, when I remember my friend Derek came to me and was trying to convince me that I should do hydraulics. And back then, I knew a couple people with hydraulics. They all had problems. They all leaked.
Yep.
And I thought, this is just going to ruin my car. This is going to be a horrible idea. I had air shocks. I was kind of low, but I wanted to be lower and I wanted to be low in the front. He was like, look, man, you do accumulators or you do coils. We can make it ride really good. It'll be great. And finally, I just kind of broke down. I was like, you know what? Screw it. Let's go. Let's do it. So I bought Red's Hydraulics used to advertise a kit for $99.99 or $999, and I bought 4 batteries at Price Club. This is before it was Costco, and my friend Christian Ash installed it at his place in Mesa. We broke it once before it left his driveway. We broke it twice, once or twice that night. Uh, that Red's kit, without getting too technical, the motor is here. You've got your pump here. There's a splines on each end. To join them, you have a coupler. Reds intentionally made a coupler that was easy to break so that you didn't, if you overlocked the pump, you wouldn't actually strip the gears in the pump. It was a good idea, except the thing broke too easy. And so
Yeah.
I broke that coupler. It's like a $10 part, but I broke it like 3, 4 times in that first night. But that really got me hooked. The feeling of hitting a switch, lifting your car, or dragging parts, which at the time was mostly my exhaust tip, right? Doing things like that was just so exhilarating for me. It was like next level stuff. and I became the guy with the juice Civic, and so I kind of moved it forward from there.
Did you do any different modifications when you put it on? Because I think if I remember right, yours was lower than most Civics that were on juice, right?
Yeah, so eventually what ended up happening was I ended up getting the car painted. And when I got the car painted, I also had a roll cage built. And the reason why was I had that sliding right top and the Civic is a unibody, and I would three-wheel the car all the time. So to do that, I had a 10-inch cylinder in the back, I had an 8 in the front. I would do it one of two ways. I would either lock it up, I drop the side and then lift the front, uh, or lift the rear to get a rear three wheel, or to get a front, I would drop the corner as I was driving. And the problem was that I had this dent that would rotate sides. Like the dent would switch
As
side to
it
sides because I
deflects.
had this big, yeah, because I had this big hole in my roof, right? So I took it to my buddy Jim, and he built a roll cage for me. Now, it wasn't like a track tested roll cage or anything, but it tied into the dashboard, it tied into the trunk. There was a main hoop that was open all the way around so that I could, the slider was still accessible and stuff. And then it had the main hoop that went behind the seats, a crossbar for a seatbelt. There was a bottom crossbar. And so the car was super, super rigid. So when I went to get it painted, I took it to the shop. I had them shave the door handles and the moldings and the taillights and the trunk and the roof gutters because I did a bigger slider. I did a 40 by 40. So we had to shave the rain gutters and then cut into
Yeah.
those rain gutters to be able to get it to fit. So I shaved basically everything except for the gas door. And when I got it back, the car it was supposed to be candy yellow. That was actually the first color for the car. And he had panel painted the car. And the result was it was like 10 different shades of yellow, and there was just nothing I could do with it. So I took it to another shop, this guy named Frank Recklin. And Frank at the time was just kind of doing work on the side. He had a buddy named Twan who did all the body work at like in some garage in Phoenix. Like, not when I say garage, I don't mean like a shop. I mean like somebody's house.
Yeah.
He was in their garage doing body work on the car. And then Frank painted it. He rented a booth at a boatyard down in downtown Phoenix. We painted the car, and it turned out great. So the way I got so the car sits for a while. I at this point have a custom car shop called K2 Customs. It's not doing great, but I Frank and I had developed a relationship, so we built this shop called Platinum Concepts. My Civic is done, but it doesn't have wheels. It's not very exciting. So get I find out that Severed Ties is having a car show, and Frank is in Severed. So he's like, okay, well let's get a booth out there. We'll show off the business and do whatever. He's like, we need to get your car going, so you need to borrow some wheels. So I borrowed some wheels from somebody, and I parked the car. And I was so exhausted from getting everything ready. They're like, we had a van, and I just like sat in the back of the van and passed out. Right at that show was Courtney Halliwell. Courtney Halliwell knew Frank just kind of through the car scene,
Yeah.
and said to Frank, like, hey, uh, I'd love to shoot this car for this magazine. And I said, okay. And he said, okay, cool. It's like, here's my card, give me a call. Frank told me about it. I was super excited. I called him a couple of days later and I said, hey, are you interested in shooting it? He said, sure. I actually have two guys in town right now, and they'd love to come down and do it. They were at my shop in a half hour, and the next day we were shooting the car for the cover of Import Racer. So that was the first cover.
I was
Now, the
thinking it was
next,
Euro, or is that?
mm-mm. Euro was next, so I'm
Okay.
getting there. So Import Racer happens, and around the same time, it's the first issue. They're trying to do something big with it, and uh, they want to do a big launch at the SEMA International Auto Salon. Okay, now this was an event that I did not know about. I did not know much about SEMA at the time. It was like '99, I want to say, and so they wanted to take pictures of the car. They wanted to create a poster. They wanted to put a couple of models on the poster, and then they were going to have my car parked at the show with the models signing the poster at the event. That was the deal. So I had to bring my car out there. So I took it out for the photo shoot. I drove out to California. We shot it off some golf course or something like that. And then I had like a month, I want to say. to come back and shoot the car, or to come back and go to the show. Around the same time, I meet Marco from Lowrider Euro. And I had written my first article in Import Racer at this point. The first article I ever wrote was actually the article on my car. They reworked it because to do it as like an interview format, but essentially that was it. And that gave me my career, which I am today as a writer.
Now,
But I had
who
reached
had
out.
Import Racer? What publishing company? I remember Import Tuner. I don't remember Import Racer.
Import Racer was the same company that did Street Trucks.
Okay.
So it was Y Visionary
Back then, yeah,
or whatever. I mean, it's offshot so many different times now, but
yeah.
yes, it was Y Visionary, I think, at the time. So they so I reached out to Marco at Lowrider Euro. I think it was to write something else, and then I told him about my car. Somehow I got hooked up, and they wanted to shoot it for the cover of Lowrider Euro. And I said, well, I happen to be in California the week of the International Auto Salon, so why don't we go out there then? I'll just I think I was there until Sunday, and then I stayed the next night, and we do the shoot Monday. He's like, great. So at this point, I had a wheel sponsor, which was KMC Wheels, and I think I had a tire sponsor then too, which was Toyo, and I had a bunch of other stuff. And so I was ready. So here's where here's where the story gets interesting. Uh, at this point, the car is done. I didn't have to do anything. I could just drive it into a show. Now, it sat on the tires on a 17-inch wheel. It would lay pretty low on a 16, but it didn't actually lay flat. And I wanted it to lay flat. I wanted it to lay flat pretty bad. And I decided, let's see what I can do and make it happen. So I remember sitting in my garage, and I had taken off one of the fenders, and I was looking at it, and I called my buddy Mason. And this car was pretty pristine at this point. The engine bay is painted, everything's done really nice. And I asked my buddy Mason, I said, man, if I cut this up, like you're a painter, can you fix this? And he's like, man, it's only sheet metal, and they make that stuff all day long. And I said, you know what? All right, let's cut it up. So what I did was, out back, there was a company called Rain Motorsports, and they made a dropped trailing arm. So in the back of a Civic, you have a trailing arm that goes parallel. Your wheel is, or your rotor's here, drum actually, and then you have your shock. So your trailing arm goes up and down. They made a drop trailing arm, so the drum mount was up about 2 inches. So I got those, and doing the back was relatively easy, because what I did was I cut out the fender well, and then I reinforced in certain areas, but I didn't have the time to be able to actually tub it. Okay, so if you were to open my trunk at that show, you would have seen 2 tires sitting right there. But what I then did was, up front, I had to get the front end down lower, and Rain Motorsports was working on a drop spindle, but they didn't have it yet. So I asked my buddy again, I said, how do I do this? And the cars have a cast iron spindle, and he takes them out of the spindle. But what you got to do is you got to heat it up real hot when you're welding it. And you got to kind of I think he said to put it in sand or something like that. I had to cut notches in it and put some little, some tabs in there. Like I had to do some stuff to kind of try to make it work.
Yeah.
Because ultimately I couldn't pitch my upper control arm higher. It was already as high as it was going to go. So I couldn't go higher with that. So I had to lower that down by lowering the spindle down, which would lower the, anyways, that's what I did. And at this point, my car had 4 Optima batteries, and it had a 4-pump hydraulic setup with whammy tanks. So a whammy tank is one tank that joins two pumps. Right. So I had those 2 stacked on top of each other, and I had an 8-inch cylinder in the front, and I had a 10-inch cylinder in the back, and I was running on accumulators all the way around, and those 4 Optima batteries. Okay. So I had a roll cage. I had 5-point harnesses. And I didn't have a trailer. I didn't have anything like that. I was like 24 or something along those lines. I didn't have any money. I barely had money to make it out there. So I called up my buddy James, and I said, hey, you want to come with me to California? I'm going to go for a couple of days. Wouldn't it be nice to have a road trip, buddy? He said, sure. So we cruised out to LA. The show was in Anaheim, I want to say. So we got like, God, it was like a Motel 8 or something. It
That's
was a
what we all
real, yeah, it was a real roach motel, and it was not great. And I remember we went to the show, we did the show, and nobody expected my car to be that low. It was sitting full rocker all the way around. I had cut out the fenders up front. Like, it was hammered. It was just tanked. And at
What'd you
that
cut?
point too,
What'd you cut on the fenders out front? Like the inner fenders,
yeah. So the
which
the
is
in
the
the
strut,
engine
right?
bay,
Or the strut? Yes.
yeah, on either side of the strut tower, you've got a little bit of a tub there.
Yeah.
I cut that.
I know a lot of guys were doing the triangles up top by the strut mount to allow the control arms to come into the engine bay. I know there's a lot
Hmm.
of guys out here that would just cut the little circle out or whatever and let that ball joint come into the engine bay.
And I did that. But the problem was, like, I did that. The At first, when I did that, I was just low, and it would give me extra travel, so I wasn't smacking that control arm on the strut tower. And eventually, what would happen is the ball joint would start to pop out of the control arm. So I would put like two or three tack welds on the corner of the ball joint to the control arm to hold it there. Okay, so genius, genius engineering here. So I said, okay, I'm going to tack weld it in there, then I won't have the problem. And ultimately, if my ball joint ever wore out, I could buy new control arms from Honda for like $100 a pair.
Yeah.
So that's what I did. I went through like two or three different pairs like that. But and I did cut so that the control arms could come into the engine bay. But I also had to now cut out for the tire. That was the other thing. So there was a little bit of the arch. I remember there was some wiring I had to move a little bit, and then there was some of the inner structure that I had to cut out so that the tire had room to come in. So that was why my buddy was like, "Yeah, I could still paint it for you. I could take care of it." So the car was super low, and I remember at the time I had a Greddy exhaust on it, but they didn't make a Greddy exhaust for the DX. So I had essentially the rear half, and I used like a slip joint connector to get the two joints connected because it was a steel exhaust and stainless steel from Greddy, and I didn't have the time. Again, I was trying to rush things to get out to the show, right? So I used a little slip joint coupler to get there. And when I was leaving the auto salon, I drug it so hard, I pulled that exhaust apart. So now I've got a Greddy exhaust that's just kind of hanging there looking pretty. And now I'm just full open header on this, four banger as I'm bombing down the freeway. So the next day, James and I take the car to KMC Wheels. We meet my sponsor back there, this guy named Jaime, super great guy. And then we shoot the car for the magazine for Lowrider Euro. Shoot goes great. Everything's fantastic. Have a really good time. And I remember after the shoot, it was getting dark. It's like 4 o'clock, maybe 5 o'clock. And me and James went to Quiznos and we had a sub. And then we hopped on I-10 and we drove home. So let's talk about what happened on the drive home.
So to step back before that, so if I remember
Yeah,
right, you had a bunch of apples in your like lead shot or whatever for the feature. That was the one in Euro, right?
that was Import Racer. It was
Okay,
Import Racer
that's
that
the one
had
I
the apples, I
remember.
think. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the one with Lowrider Euro had a model with it, which was funny because when the model showed up, it turned out my friend who was with me had dated her at one point. So it was,
Oops.
yeah, it was kind of a funny moment. But yeah, I at that point the car was known as the Bad Apple. It was apple green, and I always kind of thought it was a funny little name, a funny little nickname for it. Uh, so it all kind of worked out. So we're driving home. Now, when you shave the taillights on a Civic, uh, you should probably put new taillights in, is the logical thing to do. What I had done was the car had a wing on it. Okay. It had a Wings West wing, but it wasn't one that had any kind of lift to it. It was literally like sitting on the deck lid,
Yeah.
and it had an LED in the middle. Then I had my third brake light. So what I did, and I got pulled over, and I was told it was legal, but it was very borderline legal. I wired up my third brake light so it would be a running light and a brake light. Okay. Then my third brake light was my brake light. So I technically had running lights and brake lights. And as long as my window was down, I had turn signals because I had hands. So that was
Motorcycle
That
move.
was the Yes, that was the way that was going to work. Uh, so we drove. It was late and dark. Now I'm I don't know if you have ever taken the drive between Los Angeles to Phoenix. Um, I have done it so many times at this point. It's fear inducing, but basically there is a stretch of nothing for a good hour and a half, and it's somewhere in Palm Springs to about Blythe. Blythe is roughly on the border. You cross the border to Arizona, then Quartzite's like the next major town. So Blythe, about a half hour or so from the border, give or take, and Palm Springs is like an hour and a half away from that, maybe 2 hours. So it's a whole lot of nothing. Like it's like Death Valley
Yeah.
kind of area. So it's dark. It's late. We're driving a '96 Civic like a hovercraft. We're just hovering down on the ground. It's full open header. That exhaust is doing nothing. I got the slider open and we got the windows down, or we had the windows cracked at least a little bit, and we're just cruising. Now, my Civic had a couple of safety features built in for the hydraulics. Okay. The first one was a ground clamp. In with a car with hydraulics, a hydraulic pump is only supposed to work on 12 volts. And you have a switch that operates between them called the solenoid. So you have a battery and a solenoid that goes to the pump. The idea is you hit your switch, which activates the solenoid, which sends the power from the battery through the solenoid to the pump. Okay.
Yeah.
The thing is, when you're doing a car with hydraulics, you're doing multiple batteries. You're wiring them so that you have 48 volts at the end instead of 12, or 60 if you got 5 batteries. So that means those 12-volt solenoids can burn out pretty quick. And they burn out one of two ways. They burn out shut, so they don't work, or they burn out open, so they only work. And so you have a ground clamp, which is the ground from your batteries, and it's literally like a welding clamp. You twist it, it's under your seat, so if you ever have a problem, you can just twist it, pull it apart. If you've ever seen a hopper, like
Yep.
a
Hanging out
64
the trunk.
Impala or whatever, right, hanging out the trunk so they can quick disconnect it if they have to. Stops fires, all sorts of stuff. The other thing I had was, look, I was a white kid who grew up in Scottsdale, Arizona in the early 90s. So, of course, I love Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and NWA, Ice Cube, all that stuff, right? Hardcore gangster rap from the West Coast. That is me through and through.
Same here.
Either Ice Cube or Dre, somebody like that said, I have 16 switches for the bitches in my hood. So I had a 16 switch panel. But I also was wise enough to know that you can't just have 16 switches floating around on your seat all the time, because I had a big cable so I could put it out of the car if I wanted to or whatever. And like, I knew I couldn't do that. So I had a switch that turned off that switch panel. And then I had 4 switches in the dash. So on the Civic, it had a little tiny center console, and there was an area for a CD player, I think. Most of the time it was a pocket, but you could get a CD player for it, or maybe it was a tape player. I don't know. And I had put a panel in there where I had 4 switches. So I had front, back, side to side, and then I had an off switch. It was like one of those F16 style switches, big red thing. You knock it down, it turns everything off. So my switches, my 16 switch panel was supposed to be off, and my switches in the dash were on, and I have my ground clamp. We're driving. James is in the passenger seat. I got my 5-point harness on. I don't think he has a seatbelt on. We're driving, and and James goes, I've got a cramp. And he lifts up his leg. And right as he does that, I am turning left to change lanes. And that's when he hit a seesaw opposite corners switch. Now, what that does is it dropped my front left corner and it locked up my rear right corner. I thought I had the switch panel off. Okay. And to be clear, I don't blame James for this in any way. I have seen James since. He's a great guy. I don't have any problem with him. I certainly don't blame him for this. And in the back of a Civic, when you have 10-inch cylinders on a stock trailing arm, your suspension does this, right? So when you're low, you have negative camber. When you raise up, it levels out. When you go higher, it goes positive camber. Now that's stock trailing arms with a 10-inch cylinder. When you have lowered trailing arms, it goes an extra level. It goes negative, goes straight, goes positive, and then toes out. So what happens? Really, I should have put an 8-inch cylinder back there. If I had done that, I would have been fine. It's not like I needed the lift. So what I did was as I was changing lanes, my car was already turning, my rear right wheel went and kicked out. So now I'm going sideways, doing about 80 miles an hour, going down I-10. I-10 at this point, I'm 10 minutes outside of Blythe. There's nothing around us except for a prison. It's a 2-lane road, and in the middle is a dirt median that's about as wide as 3 lanes of highway traffic, and then there's another 2 lanes on the other side. I have taken that trip, like I said, many, many, many times. And almost the entire length of that trip, that median is a dip. It's a wash, okay, because we have lots of problems with flooding in Arizona and the desert and stuff like that. So it's a wash. It's to let water go through. Here, it was flat. I don't know why it was flat, but it was flat. We went sideways into the median. We caught a rock, flipped the car on its roof. I'm now upside down, perpendicular to traffic, suspended by my 5-point harness, fully upside down. I undo my belt. I pop out. I fall to the floor. I feel sand because slider was open, right?
Yeah.
I look next to me. James is upright in the regular position. The car had kind of spun around him almost. Like he had almost floated of sorts. Car rotated around him onto the lid. We get out of the car, give each other a hug, like, oh my God, I can't believe I made it out of this. We tow the car to the junkyard or to the tow lot, send pictures to insurance. Insurance says it's totaled, or insurance sent an adjuster out, car was totaled. And
I always
I
wonder
had
what happened
to
to
pay.
it.
Yeah, the car was totaled. Every panel was wrecked except for, I think, maybe the trunk. It was real bad. And so they said, take anything off of it you need to. Just make sure you've got, your tires. Make sure it can roll. So I pulled out the full suspension, all the hydraulics, all the batteries. I took off the steering wheel. I think I took out the seats. I took off basically anything I could that I could hang on to. And it was crazy because it took me 4 or 5 years to build that car. It took me 4 or 5 hours to pull it apart. I loaded everything into the back of a U-Haul pickup and drove home. It was pretty rough.
Alex, I always wonder what happened to it. So that means when the feature come out for Euro, it was already gone at that point.
Yeah, in fact, I was just thinking about it. I wonder if I have that picture handy still, because I have pictures of it somewhere right here. But does it matter? No, no, it doesn't matter. Anyways, yeah, I called Marco after that shoot, and I called Marco once I got home, because I roll the car out in the middle of the desert. It's like 3.5 hours from where I am at home. I'm like, how am I going to do this? I had to call my folks and tell them, yeah, my car got totaled, and I'm, out in the middle of the desert somewhere. Can you come out and pick me up? So they drove out the next day and did that. Picked me and James up. We had to stay at another roach motel, and this time it was literally a roach motel. Like I saw cockroaches everywhere. And you know, I called Marco when we got back, and I was like, "Hey, man, I hope you got some good pictures because the car's gone. Totaled it on the way home." And I think that was at the end of that article. That's something that they mentioned was that Kevin totaled the car, and the bad apple is now applesauce, something along those lines. And and that was that. So for a while, it was, oh, that's Kevin. He built the bad apple. Now, the other part of this is that I told you about the spindle modifications that I made. The big rumor at the time was you screwed up your spindles, they broke. Sure didn't. That car still pulled straight at the end of it. It was literally just a problem of the car locked up, went the opposite direction, nothing I could do about it. I tried to recover, but I don't know that I could recover from that today with 30 years of driving experience under my belt. It was a pretty gnarly situation.
What year did the feature come out?
I think the first, I want to say Import Racer was 99. It might have been 2000. And then the Lowrider Euro was 2000 or 2001.
See,
Yeah. So I was,
that's the same time frame I have because Mini Truck can come out for mine in '99, and then regular lowrider
yep.
come out in 2000. So I thought we were about the same time
Yeah.
frame there.
Yeah. When my, the next car I built was a Focus wagon. It was an orange Ford Focus wagon, and I ended up getting that shot for Lowrider Euro 2. And I ended up being the only person, I believe, to ever make the cover of the magazine twice.
Nice.
So yeah, so Lowrider Euro ended up turning into Lowrider Edge, and then it kind of fell off and
Yeah.
disappeared along the way.
My protege five, Joe Greaves, shot it, and by like literally like a month after he shot it for Euro or Edge or whatever it was, then they closed the doors on it. So mine was literally like the next issue, from what I understand, was going to come out in it. And then it just, of course, never happened.
Yeah, it was a weird time because there were still those cars were being built. People were building them, but we didn't have an outlet. Like there was a car magazine that was kind of like, I wouldn't say it was a backyard operation, but it was pretty tiny. There were a couple of books like that that were doing stuff, but not a lot. And Mini Truckin' was trying with their, the mini truck car features in the back.
Which was what mine
There
was
was a
in.
market there. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I wanted to be in that real bad. And there was a market for it. It just never really took off. It wasn't enough to be able to sustain Euro and Edge, so it kind of was what it was. It was unfortunate. I did really I enjoyed those magazines.
Well, it's like, Sport Compact Car and Import Tuner were the ones that got me hooked. But back then, they were doing Doug Starbuck paint jobs. They had shaved door handles. It wasn't about how fast you could make it or how many points your roll
Hmm.
cage was. It was basically the custom vehicles. And then they switched to the race stuff. And I quit reading them at that point. So
Yeah, there was I remember there was an issue with a Prelude on the cover that was peach in color. I want to say it had a sliding rag top,
square body.
and it was like, yeah, yeah, square
Yeah.
body style Prelude. Had graphics on the bottom, and I remember going, man, that thing's so cool. These like back then, I would get the magazine at whatever store I could find it at, usually a grocery store. I'd take it to school with me. Me and my buddies at lunch would be pouring through, and oh, look at that, and auto sound and security and everything. It
Yep.
was if something was to make an impact, the earliest you would see it would be 90 days from the day it appeared. You know what I mean? Like truck shows, my first run, Endless 94, I think turned up in trucking like later that spring. And it was the soonest you could put it on the market. Whereas today, if I were to do something cool and put it on Instagram, it could be done, minutes, seconds later.
Or if you miss a show, you can find out what's at the show by 10 o'clock in the morning without even being there.
You can have people doing it live and
Yeah.
you could just follow them along and see what's going on. Yeah, I think there was something special for me, without, being all old man yells at cloud about this whole thing, but it's I having those truck runs and having those big events where it was, truck runs were 3-day events where you go, you camp, one day's a camp and party, one day's a show and party, next day's awards and party and drive home. Like those events were just so you built such a tight community with everybody. And here in Phoenix, we had first it was the Scottsdale Pavilions, which is a local mall. First, that was our big hangout, and then after that, it was 35th Avenue in Peoria was always popular, and the Walmart parking lot down in Mesa, and then there was Kiwanis Park. There were all these spots where you could go and see people from all across the valley. And Phoenix is a big town. Right now we're the fifth largest city in the country. Like you would see people from all the way on the west side of town, all the way on the east side of town. They'd all show up at this one place so they could drag their cars or their trucks, pull it through a parking lot, show off and show what you got that's cool. Oh, Tom body dropped his S10. He's the first guy to do that. He did a stock floor. How does he do that? You see it all at the hangout on Saturdays.
We used to have the cruising strip here, and then it got to, where the cops would start shutting it down. And it's like they've tried to, revive that over the years here and there, and it just never works out. Ours was 3 lanes, a concrete median, like a short median, not a wall, and then 3 lanes. So everybody would be in what we
Yeah.
called the suicide lane, because you would be in the left lane, so you could holler at the girls as you went by, and normal traffic
Yep.
wouldn't know you were stopped and rear end somebody. So yeah, that was where most of my high school, even some middle school with older friends and all that's where mine were. So now there's really nothing like that for the kids anymore.
No, we had Mill Avenue was our other one too, which is in Tempe. It used to be 2 lanes and you'd sit in the right lane. And the deal was they had somebody who would sit, so it's 2 lanes on each side, and then there's a median in the middle, and they would have somebody with a laptop, a cop with a laptop doing license plates. And so you could get 3 passes before it was cruising. So you would go by those cops and you'd be like, hey, are they looking? Are they writing down my, no, they didn't get my plate. All right, we got another turn. And then, your buddy would be hanging out the window talking to chicks or,
Yeah.
doing whatever. Um, and having a car with hydraulics at that window in time is great because you can pop it up, you can show it off and stuff like that. I, the, the thing about the Civic overall is that the Civic, like it, okay, when you start off doing cars and there are magazines and there are things like this in the world, your goal is to be on one of those magazines.
Yep.
Just be in it, right? Cover is the ultimate goal. But are you going to get cover? I don't know, maybe, maybe not, but that's the goal, right? You just want to be in a magazine. Next step up is cover. That car got me that magazine and it got me that cover. Now that first cover wasn't a huge cover. I was one of like 3 or 4 different things. But then Lowrider Euro, it was the cover. And then it was like, how do I top that? How do I get better than that? Is there another mountain for me to climb here? But it also gave me my career. Like that first article for the Civic was the first article I ever wrote. It's horrible. It's god awful. Okay. But it's the first thing I ever wrote that led to me writing for Lowrider Euro and Lowrider and Truckin' and Street Trucks and all the different books to the point where I'm now writing actual books that you can buy at Barnes and Noble. Like it's that car gave me that, but it also gave me like this. At the time, I had such a big head about, I had such an ego about who I was and who I thought I was because I had reached the mountaintop and everybody should just be so proud of me and I was so special and I got knocked down a peg real hard around that same window of time and I made some stupid mistakes and I ate crow. I realized it, it's not all about me. It's not about me. It's not about what I build. It's not, nobody gives a shit. Nobody cares. And even if they do, it shouldn't. It's not about me. Don't build the car because you want that attention. Build the car because you like the car. Build the car because you like the process. And I lost sight of that for a while and I just got wrapped up in my own head. And so that car is just it was such a learning experience for me in all respects. Like it taught me all these things about building cars and it taught me about myself and about my ego and how not to be an asshole and to really like step back. And it was there for me when I lost all my friends. And it was at the same time I was, I remember I got the cover of Lowrider Euro and I'm delivering pizzas at Pizza Hut. I'm top of the mountain and yet at the lowest possible feeling I could get. It was such a formative thing for me. And so as much as like I said, every 6 months it'll pop up of, oh, hey, you're the guy who wrecked his car because your spindle broke or whatever. I know the truth. James knows the truth. He was there
Yeah.
too. But as much as I know that it was such a transformational thing for me. And so, I will always look back on that car fondly. I still have the keys and I have a little chunk of Bondo, from the car, that had come off in the wreck. And so, I'm gonna frame all that someday. But the little chunk of Bondo is funny because it's not very thick. So, it's not like an inch and a half thick or anything. It's pretty thin, but it's green and you can see the yellow underneath it. So
Uh,
it's like you can kind of see like everything in this little microcosm. So, yeah, I realized after that car, even with the popularity my Focus wagon had and my full size after that and my 95 after that, even after all those things, nothing was ever going to top the Civic. And it didn't really have to. This actually came up recently. I had a 98 Tahoe for a while, a 2-door Tahoe that I had wanted for years. And I was sitting there debating whether or not to sell it. And I was like, this is a big deal to me. I've wanted this car for 20 years. I've wanted this thing forever. And I said, well, what are you going to do to it, Kevin? Well, you want to body drop it. Okay, great. You want to put an LS in it. Okay, great. You want to do the interior. Okay, suspension. What are you looking at? 40, 50, 60 grand? Why are you doing that? Are you doing it because you feel the need for somebody to like look at you and give you that pat on the back and say you did a good job, Kevin? Are you doing it because you enjoy building it and that's why you're doing it? Or are you doing it because you feel like you have something to prove? And I had to really like examine that. And I said, I, I don't have anything to prove to anybody. I've done these things before. If nobody thinks I can, then who cares?
Yeah.
I don't give a shit. At the same time, would selling it be better for one reason or another? Yeah, right now, yeah, probably. Do I want to spend 50 grand on a car? Yeah, but I've got two kids and I got a mortgage and I got other shit. Like, it's probably not the best idea. So yeah, it's okay. Let it go. We're all custodians of these things for a while, right? Like
Yeah.
Courtney told me once, Courtney from Street Trucks, told me that we were all just kind of caretakers of these cars. They'd always be somebody else's. And that's what happened with that Civic. It ended up in a junkyard out in Buckeye, and I got calls. I think you even reached out to me around that same time because somebody had because everybody was wondering where the trailing arms went. They're like, "Oh, do you still have the trailing arms?" I'm like, "I don't have it. It's at the junkyard." And I really thought about going out and getting that car. I was like, I called the junkyard and I said, "Hey, that was my car. I wrecked it. I was wondering if I could just have like a fender or something, like just something that's bashed up that you're never going to be able to resell. Can I just get a fender so I can like hang it on my garage?" And then they were like, "Yeah, sure. We don't care. If it's something that we can't do anything with, yeah, it doesn't matter." And I almost did it. And then I thought, yeah, but that's kind of like seeing your grandmother, but she's been dead for 10 years. Like it's you don't really want to dig that up. Let it be gone. Let it be done. And so that's what I did. I never went back and looked at the car and um, never did anything else with it again. And now I just have that little chunk of metal in the keys.
I've got the tag off my CRX hanging in the garage. It was about the only thing that was left when it caught fire. And the corner of the tag
Yeah.
is all crispy and everything. But that I took that and a couple of those Honda Sport billet caps. I don't know what happened to them, but like they were charred, but that being billet, they didn't really melt. But yeah, that tag hangs in my garage. That's all I have. I mean, other than the feature plaques hanging here in my office, but same thing. I mean, that one car put me on the map per se. It showed what I could do, and then that's what got me hooked. So kind of same thing as yours. So
Yeah, it's weird how this happens. Like I'm sure you know people who built a car and then disappeared. You have no idea what happened to them, right? Um, or people who had a shop and this was their whole life, and then the shop disappeared and you never hear from them again. And in my case, I have disappeared here and there. I wasn't really building anything for a while when my son was born, and money was tight and it was real difficult to do stuff. And so so I didn't build cars for a while, and it you kind of step back, but I also again I just think about all the things that working on cars has given me, and that means a lot.
yeah. Well, you mentioned that you got started with the writing stuff with the magazines. Um, you just did writing, or did you do photos and stuff as well?
I started with writing because it was the easiest entry point. And then shortly thereafter, I realized that if I brought them an entire feature, I didn't have to wait. Because what I was doing was, at Import Racer, I'd reach out to the editor, Paul Morton, and I'd say, yeah, Import Racer. I'd say, "Hey, do you have an article?" He'd send me an article a month. So, okay, great. Here's an article. I get a couple $100 for it, and I write it and I send it back off. But if I had a feature, if I had a car I could do, then I would do that. So I started taking pictures at first. Uh, I was early enough that digital was so expensive I couldn't really get into it. So I was using slide film and I was shooting features for like I think Auto Sound and Security was one of my first ones, and then there were a couple other ones here and there that I did. And then it just rolled. I started doing both, and I was doing photography and writing. And it was '06. I had met my wife. We were still just dating at the time, but I'd met my wife, and in '06, I did my taxes and I realized I made 10 grand doing this stuff on the side.
Yeah,
And I said, hell man, if I can do this just working on weekends and barely putting any time and effort into this, I might be able to make some decent money if I actually did it full time. And so I was working as the office manager of a bus lot at the time. And I left that job in '08 to be a copy editor at a magazine. That led into an editor role at another magazine. And these were all, lifestyle and travel brands and stuff like that. But it gave me more purchase. It let me do more writing, do more work. I'm writing for websites. I'm writing for other people. I'm writing for the car magazine still. And it really kind of upped my writing game. It's you're putting in the reps. You're
You
doing the work.
you wasn't a car or truck magazine editor though. You were something different though, wasn't you?
Right. I was mostly like there was a motorcycle magazine, but it was for like a motorcycle club. I was the editor of Rebel magazine, which was a men's publication here in town. I did get interviewed for a role at Sport Truck in '08, and I talked about it and with my wife, and we debated it. But it was moving to Orange County, and the money wasn't that great. And I just thought, oh, it's not really a great idea. And Kevin Aguilar ended up being the guy to get that role.
Okay.
And then a year later, Sport Truck shut down. And I was like, oh man, I'm glad I didn't, put my whole life in full upheaval to be able to do that. I felt good about that. And then in 2010, I started freelancing full time, or 2009 rather. And my plan was to shoot like a certain amount of features a month, turn them in, get paid, take a couple of months for me to make some money. Then my wife got laid off, and the truck magazine stopped paying. Like quite literally, they
Yep.
stopped paying. I
Or
had
shut
at
down.
one point, yeah, yeah, at one point I was owed 10 grand from various publications.
Same.
And I was like, what am I going to do with this? And then what was even crazier is that like 2013 or 14, my stuff would start showing up in magazines, and I'd be like, hey, you owe me a check. And they're like, why? This is lowrider staff. And I'm like, yeah, I was lowrider staff in 2008 or whatever. I was the guy who did this. Do you want me to send you the negatives or the digital files? I'll send you whatever you need. So it was, the truck stuff kind of came and went, and I wasn't really doing a lot for him. And then Aguilar reached out to me somewhere around 13, and he said, hey, you still writing for car magazines? And I said, I don't know. Are you paying? And he's like, yeah, yeah, we're paying. And I go, okay, great. Then I'll do some work for you. And that was right around the time, 2015, I think, was when I got the first call about writing a book. And I kind of thought the guy was full of shit. I was like, no, this guy's. He hit me up on LinkedIn, like he doesn't know anything. And then eventually I was like, fine, just send over the contract. I'll take a look at it. And then I sent it in, and then I got a check, and I was like, oh crap, I got to actually do this thing now. And then, yeah, I wrote my first book, and it took a while, but then I enjoyed it so much. I wrote my second and then my third, and I got my fourth coming out in a couple of months now.
And what was for the
So,
listeners? What was the books?
so the first book was How to Restore Your Chevy Truck, 1973 to 1987. So it is, let me see here. It is roughly 176 pages, full color images, top to bottom restoration book. It's like a Chilton's guide that is more focused on the restoration process uh, and everything like that. So that was the first one. That was on square bodies. The second one was on 67 to 72s and Chevy trucks. And then the third one was installing air ride suspension. So I did one on bagging cars, which is ironic, just based on my history and all that after all those years of loving hydraulics with the Civic and the Focus, and I had a full size that was done that way too. And I had a license plate for a while that said FKBAGS, which got through the DMV, but it really did mean fuck bags. Uh, so between all those things, one would think I would not ever write an air book, but I wrote an air book, and I'm super happy with it. And now the next book I'm doing is, or that's come out is, or coming out rather, How to Build and Modify Your Chevy Truck 88 to 98. So it's the OBS
Yeah, stuff. Nice.
Chevy trucks. Yeah, yeah.
And those you said you can find in Barnes and Noble and everywhere.
Barnes and Noble, Amazon, your local independent person. They're here. I've got the Air one right here. They look like this. So yeah, that's my buddy Adam's Impala wagon in his Riviera. I shot that the very first the very first week I started my company, Whips Industries, when I started freelancing full time, I shot his cars that weekend, and nobody ever ran them in a magazine. I thought those things. I was super happy with it. So when I had the opportunity to put it on this, I was like, hey, can we run this in there? Can we do this for the cover? They're like, yeah. And I'm like, all right, finally get to get Adam's cars on a cover like they deserve.
Now you talk about, the magazines owing all that money and stuff. There were several back in the day. I'm like, all right, well, if you owe me, five, eight, $10,000, like I'm not going to keep sending you stuff until you pay me. And then they finally would
Hmm.
catch up. And there's been so many publishing companies like that, magazines that, they get paid for the issue because it's already two or three issues already, in the can. Like they got two or three more out, and you're like, okay, well, where's my pay at? Oh, well, we're working on
Yeah,
that. I'm like, well, I know you got paid. What about us that actually put that in there? And
it did the work.
there were some magazines closed down that, I was owed money for, and you just never got it because they were gone. I know, trucking shut down. It was like that. I think mini trucking, when it shut
Hmm.
down, I had stuff that I never got paid for. So
Yeah, yeah. No, it was super rough. I, you know, I, 2009, it's October. I leave this job because they're going to shut down. And sure enough, they would like a couple of months later. My wife has a job, but she's pregnant with my son. You know, we've got like he was born in February. It's October. I'm like, I'm great. My wife's got a job. We've got health insurance. Everything's fine. And then sure enough, a month later, she gets laid off. We don't get any insurance coverage out of that, which means that we can't get insurance coverage for the baby that's coming. And I had to figure out a way to make money like now, like not in 6 months. I had
yeah.
to make money today. And it was terrifying. It was a couple of months where it was really rough. And I'm doing magazine stuff and hoping and praying that those checks are going to come in. And I remember I had a series going at one of the magazines on tech articles. And then the editor bought a truck just like mine and started doing it too. And I was like, oh
And didn't
crap,
have to pay anybody.
my
Didn't come
stuff's
out of their budget.
right, right. And later on, when I would become editor of other magazines, I would have freelancers and I would make sure I would like work real hard with the publisher and with advertising and like with everybody else. I was like, you get those damn checks out on time. Like I'm not having somebody sit for 90 days on work that they did 90 days prior. Like you get that check out like right away so that we don't have to deal with it because it was so stressful for me. I didn't want anybody else to have to deal with that stress. And don't get me wrong, not every publisher was perfect from when I was working with them, but such a crazy time in that industry. And I don't know that it's ever really recovered quite
No.
the same way. Like we've got magazines now; they're not as big, and street trucks. You've got all your different builder variations and stuff like that going on too. But operations are different, and it just all kind of functions different and whole different world. I mean, look, back when you and I started, like if you shot a cover, you'd make some bank.
Oh yeah.
And
Oh
today,
yeah.
yeah,
I
I
almost
made one.
I almost pulled the plug with Pepsi many a years. I'm like, oh man, I'm making, almost as much on the weekends as I am at Pepsi, but I'm gone all the time. Let me do this. And then I'd get slapped in the face like, oh, well, two of the magazines shut down, or hey, we're not using
Hmm.
freelancers anymore. We're only taking free submissions. Like Mini Trucking did that for a while. And I was like, well,
Yeah,
I'm just
that's
gonna
right.
stick it out with Pepsi, and then like it would come back and forth. And then I finally, after 22 years, I'm like, man, I'm just going to do this full time, not knowing, I had no plans. I had no backup. It's like, I'm leaving this job I've had for 22 years. Let's see if we make it happen. Shoot. Now I work a quarter of what I used to at Pepsi and make more money. Like I'm happier. So if
Yeah,
I would have done it
yeah,
sooner, I probably never would have been where I'm at now. So
yeah. That's the thing, right? Like again, sometimes it's about how these things happen when they're supposed to. You may not realize it. Like my shop was failing. I didn't have career options. I'd end up delivering pizza. That writing for these magazines turned into something, and so for I had a good 8, 9 year run of working for those books and getting paid for it. I remember when I shot my first cover, I got, I don't know if it was a grand, but it was pretty close. I made pretty good money for that cover. And then the article that came with it was like another $750 or something. Last time I got a check from a magazine, I think it was $150 or something for
what was
writing an
that
article.
first? What
So
was your first cover?
cover sport truck, it was a fourth, it was a you remember the Chevy SS that came out between like 99 and '06? I want to
Yeah.
say it was like '04, '05. Okay. So what we did was I got on a crane, or a pallet jack on a pallet with my tripod, and we had one of those SSs that was held by a tow strap behind it by an F-350, and it did a four-wheel burnout, and I shot it from overhead. And so I did this four-wheel drive burnout for Sport Truck magazine, and it got on somewhere in there, like, I don't know, '05, '06, '07, somewhere in that window. Love that cover. Love that cover. I was super happy with it. Broiling smoke. You couldn't even see the toe strap in the background because there was so much smoke all over the place. It was a fun cover. Scary as shit though. I mean, I'm on a pallet up in the air. I'm afraid of heights anyways. You put me more than 2 feet off the ground, I get shaky. So like, here I am holding a tripod, trying to get everything balanced. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
it was a little bit of a nightmare and a lot
We
of
used to
fun.
do that quite a bit at Pepsi to get stuff off the top of the racks, and we just hope OSHA wouldn't come in. I mean, you're just
I know,
hanging
right?
on and hope you don't fall. But I think Sport Truck was probably the only truck magazine I never had a cover for.
Mm,
You know,
yeah. Well, look, dude, you've done so much. Like I think we said this earlier, but I remember being handed articles like, "Hey, Brandon shot this," and I'm like, "Oh no, shit, I know Brandon." It's always cool to watch people's arc, to watch how they are continuing to do things and continuing to build stuff. And I've always appreciated that.
I think if I add it up, there's over 30 titles, like different magazines I've shot for over the years, and I think
Hmm.
three of them are all that exist anymore.
Yeah, that's true. Huh? Yeah. Yeah, that's a bummer. When Mini Truckin' shut down, that hit me pretty hard. That one got me.
Well, I think the next big one when Truckin' and Import Tuner and the Ford magazines and the GM magazines, like they lost, I think, 14 titles in one day. That's, I think,
Yeah.
the one that hit me the most because I shot for all 14 of those. So then I'm like, all right, well,
Yeah.
what's the point of even going and shooting? Because no one's paying anymore. Like, what am I going to do?
Yeah. 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 I remember when I before the Focus, I want to say maybe it was before the Civic. I remember going to Lowrider's offices. I met up with Marco and a couple other people. Nathan Trujillo, I think, was the other guy, and they showed me like the van or the semi trailer. Because remember, Lowrider used to host their own shows. They had a semi trailer carrying cars. They showed me like their warehouse full of stuff. I got a couple free T-shirts out of it. Like I remember being told that Lowrider is the monster. Like it was described as the monster, and it was the one that was paying the bills for pretty much everything. Like Lowrider was bringing in so much money from advertising that Sport Truck could have a crappy month and it didn't matter because Lowrider was paying the bills. Like it was like 300 pages at one point.
And now
And
they're all
then yeah, yeah, when I saw that Lowrider was gone, I was like, oh, that one hit me hard too. I was like, oh man. Um, yeah, it was rough. I do like the fact that there's some magazines kind of coming out. Like there's the CK Truck magazine
He has
that those
GM
guys are
theme
doing.
now. It's the same layout,
Yeah.
but it's I think he said like 55 and up on GM
Yep.
stuff. So you get
Yeah.
your weird like Buick Riviera can go in there.
Hmm.
I think one of the few that actually does that kind of cars. So they're
Yeah.
they're both
Yeah.
pretty big guy.
There's some cool stuff. I got a buddy of mine who has one that God, I can't remember the name of it right now either. But he has a car magazine that does like higher end stuff, like auction based stuff. So and I still I'm in Phoenix, so Barrett Jackson is up the street, and I have lots of friends who are still selling stuff at auctions, who are doing well with that kind of stuff. There's a guy down the street over here who builds custom blazers that are amazing, and it's not like the scene is dead, but things have just transitioned. That's really what it comes down to. We're not doing as many magazines now. It's more online and social media kind of
Yep.
stuff, and that's just kind of how it's gone.
Well, like Brian McCormick was saying when I had him on, back when he was at Trucking, they'd sell 250,000 copies a month. But
Yep.
that was pre YouTube. Like, if you wanted to find out about a tech article or how to do something, you had to pick up a magazine. Now you can Google it or pull it up on YouTube. And, That was
Hmm.
before all that, and they were doing that
Yeah.
many. So, I mean, it's way of the world now, I guess. So,
Yeah, I there are times when I look back at things and I think, man, it really sucks it isn't that way anymore. But then I also remember, yeah, but I still have those moments.
hmm
I was fortunate enough to live through that. I
yep,
still, if I want to find those magazines, some of them are online. I can buy somebody's lot off of eBay if I want to, and I've still got a couple of crates of them in my garage. So if I want to look at that stuff and reminisce, that's great. I had a good time. There are no more truck runs anymore either, at least not around me, and that sucks. Well, I take that back. There's a Forbidden Fantasy does one up by Havasu
yeah,
or
Brian,
Laughlin or something. Yeah,
Ovid.
but yeah, it's okay. I don't, I had my good time, and now the generation that's next, they can build their cars their way and do whatever they want. So I can have my bagged car today, and it doesn't matter to me if anybody likes it or not. I like it. I built it. I don't give a shit. It's cool. I drive it around town. People go, "Who's the guy with the gray hair? Who's driving that bagged car around?" Screw it. I don't care.
I had my Sierra out getting gas a couple months ago, and some guy comes up. He goes, "Oh man," he's like, "I love that throwback truck." I'm like, "What do you mean throwback truck?" He goes, "Man, like back in the '90s when they would lower trucks like this. That's so cool." I'm like, "Back in the '90s is like I've never stopped. Like that's been going. Oh, I didn't think they've done it since like the OBS stuff." And I'm like, "Yep, they've
Hmm.
done it every year since."
Yeah, or it's like when I was working on that OBS book, I had a whole part about building things that are period correct because I have friends who are like, yeah, I got 18s on my 98 Silverado because that's what you would have done in 1998. 20s were like rare. You certainly didn't bag it. And you might have had some simple graphics, but nothing super crazy. I know guys who are hunting around for parts from Traders, which was a big big
Yep,
truck place in California. You know, it's out there.
yep. Well, how do the listeners find you online to see what you're doing and keep up with your books and everything going on? How do they find you?
Online, almost everywhere. I'm at Kevin Whips, KevinWhip, P as in Peter, another P, S for Sam. I'm also kevinwhips.com, and yeah, those are really the main spots.
Gotcha. We'll have to check out some of the books next time I'm in the bookstore. Now that I know they're there, and see what you've done.
Absolutely. Yeah, appreciate it, man.
Well, I appreciate you coming on, man. We've been back and forth for what did we say earlier, 20, 30 years probably, and
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I'm glad we finally got to have the conversation too, as opposed to, over ICQ or AIM or whatever messaging
most
protocol we were using at the time.
most of the kids nowadays wouldn't even know what AOL is. So
Yeah, or ASL. Remember that when
yep,
you'd be like, "Hi, I'm Kevin. ASL, age, sex, location." That was
yep.
yeah, yeah. Picking up on chicks by asking ASL first. Good times.
I appreciate you coming on, man.
No problem. Thank you, sir.